These ideas will reach fertile ground with enlightened planners in the Interior Department, including a guy named John Kaufman, shown here, a hiker and a canoeist. He and others in the agency took their own initiative to craft nothing less than a new way of regarding rivers at the federal level. Hang on a sec. President Kennedy's new Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall, had supported dams as an Arizona congressman. But through the influence of conservationists, his staff, and the rivers themselves, he came to realize that we had not balanced protection with development. Frank Church of Idaho courageously stepped beyond the conservative politics of his state and helped draft a Wild Rivers bill. With an affection for his own St. Croix River, Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin broadened the approach to scenic and recreational rivers of the East. President Johnson endorsed the Wild and Scenic proposal in his 1965 State of the Union address. We should not underestimate the influence that Lady Bird, with her commitment to the natural world, had on the president. 3 years later, with a unanimous vote in the Senate and a 265-7 vote in the House, that's all, of course, hard to imagine today, the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act became law. It included 12 instant rivers and tributaries, the Middle Fork of the Feather in California, Rogue in Oregon, Middle Fork Salmon in Idaho, the Selway, Lochsa, and Clearwater in Idaho, the Rio Grande in New Mexico, the 11 Point in Missouri, and the St. Croix and Namaquagan in Wisconsin and Minnesota. The system was meant to grow, and the Act named 27 rivers for initial consideration as additional members to the program, including Pine Creek here in northern Pennsylvania. To be included, a river must be free-flowing without dams, and it needs to have one or more outstandingly remarkable values. These include geologic features, water quality, fish, wildlife, unusual hydrology, archaeologic sites, history, recreation, and scenery. Any one of those values can make a river eligible. And of course, many of them, including yours, have more than one of those values. The Act bans dams and blocks federal permits for projects harmful to the rivers. These include permits for hydroelectric dams, such as 7 that were proposed here on the White Salmon River in Washington. And the Act encourages protection of all the identified outstanding values of the river. The Act specifies 3 classifications for rivers: wild, with virtually no development; scenic, with some road access and minor developments; and recreational, which can have houses, roads, and recreation facilities. Rivers and streams of any size can be included, even very small ones, though the initial designated and study rivers were all substantial in their length and their size. The program was set up to safeguard not broad areas of land, but rather thin margins along the streams. It's easy to define the visual corridor along canyon rivers, shoreline up to rim, but harder in gentler terrain. So a quarter mile from each shore was adopted as the rule of thumb for management plans. Sections designated as wild and in federal ownership are protected from logging and mining, not necessarily the case with other classifications. The Act prescribes management plans for care of each designated river. Land use regulation by the federal government is not allowed, But the act encourages floodplain or other suitable zoning by local governments so that flood-prone building like this along the Allegheny River before it was designated might be set back from hazard zones. Designation does not mean that land can be bought as open space, although management plans can consider this. Strict limits on eminent domain are embedded in the act, and condemnation or eminent domain has been avoided entirely ever since the first few rivers were designated in the 60s and early 70s. All this was remarkable when compared to the environmental politics, of course, of today. Department of Interior planners responded to the needs of their times and acted with imagination, creating no less than a new way of regarding rivers in America. And support came from the top down as well. Secretary Udall was directed by President Johnson's chief of staff to, quote, "get more conservation measures ready." The program reflected a thoughtful, compromised approach, but passing the law was only the first step. Realizing that the program was languishing a few years later, canoeist and biologist Jerry Merrill of California wrote a letter to the American Whitewater Journal suggesting formation of a national group to push wild and scenic designations forward. Others agreed, and in 1973, 33 conservationists met and formed the American Rivers Conservation Council with the explicit purpose of adding rivers to the system. Brent Blackwelder was everyone's choice as chairman. As America's top defender of rivers, blocking unnecessary dams, he testified to Congress 100 times. Here in this photo in 1973, he ceremoniously slices a slab of pork, symbolizing the pork barrel politics of dam builders at the time. For $400 a month, the board hired a young activist, Bill Painter, as a staff of one. We promptly launched a campaign to use the Wild and Scenic Act to stop the Blue Ridge hydroelectric project on the New River of North Carolina. Hopeless by any definition, this had already been federally approved. The land had been condemned, Appalachian residents kicked out, their houses demolished, the bulldozers ready to go. Against all odds, American Rivers and North Carolina prevailed, and the new was designated wild and scenic. At the same time, a 700-foot dam was ready for construction in Hell's Canyon of Oregon and Idaho. Alerted by a local boater, a young Sierra Club lawyer, Brock Evans, filed an appeal minutes before midnight of the due date for the permit. This allowed time for a campaign that went from flat zero in political momentum to Idaho Governor Cecil Andrus saying that the dam would be built over, quote, "only over my dead body." With commitments like that, wild and scenic designation for Hell's Canyon passed in 1975. Meanwhile, in Georgia, paddling on the Chattooga River had exploded in popularity, and Georgia conservationists realized that wild and scenic designation was key to solving a growing list of problems. Governor Jimmy Carter was interested, but wanted to see the river for himself. He found his way to paddler and microbiologist Claude Terry, who had gained notoriety as the rapid shredding stuntman in the dark movie Deliverance. Claude took the governor down the river, not on the safety of a raft, but in a canoe, and the Chattooga went on to become the first river designated in the wild and scenic system in the South. The first really big advance for wild and scenic rivers came in 1978 with Representative Philip Burton. His bill packaged 144 conservation projects together, setting a new standard for protection of the American landscape. 9 new rivers, including Washington's Skagit, the Sauk, Cascade, and Swiettle, the St. Joe in Idaho, Pere Marquette in Michigan, Rio Grande in Texas, North Fork American in California, and the Delaware in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. Where at this site, Tox Island Dam, construction was virtually certain a few years before, but was now halted by an army of citizen activists and the Wild and Scenic designation. Then in 1980, 2 of the greatest games in Wild and Scenic history worked their way through the bureaucracy. In Alaska, the Shinjek and 33 other Alaskan rivers were enrolled, including the Delta, here flowing out of the Alaska Range. Also in 1980, Governor Jerry Brown of California cleverly called on an alternative means of designation. With state protection already in place, a governor can request federal enrollment by the Secretary of Interior without congressional action. The Middle Fork eel was slated for damming by Southern California water agencies. Governor Brown realized that California's safeguards could politically be undone at the state level. Only federal designation could ensure permanent protection of the Smith, the Klamath, the Trinity, and the eel. Facing delays forced at every turn by the California timber and water industries, the environmental impact statement for Brown's proposal was not ready until the last days of Jimmy Carter's presidency. Having declined a routine request by President-elect Reagan to resign the day before inauguration, Interior Secretary Andrus signed the Wild and Scenic document only hours before leaving his office, which would be taken over by James Watt. And if any of you recall the Interior Secretary reign of James Watt, these rivers would definitely not have been designated under him. Andrus's signature expanded the Wild and Scenic system by 25%. Then in 1984, one of the most intensive Wild and Scenic battles was resolved with designation of California's Tuolumne, where imminent threats of new dams and diversions were stopped. In this campaign, Chris Brown, director of American Rivers, gained traction with the term most endangered river. 3 years later, I persuaded Chris to use the same slogan for the Kings River, which we succeeded in making Wild and Scenic in 1987. 2 other additions happened that year where dams posed threats in California. The Merced is the river of Yosemite, and the Kern plunges off the highest peak in 49 states. Then in 1988, and breaking more new ground, Senator Mark Hatfield was persuaded to seek a conservation legacy to counterbalance his lifetime of support to Oregon's timber industry. The Upper Rogue was added. 53 Oregon rivers had already been recommended under Forest Service planning efforts and were now designated, including the Sandy and Whiteous Creek. In 1992, more modest bills were passed for national forest rivers in Michigan, including the Asable. And in Arkansas, another group of rivers were enrolled, including the Mulberry. Meanwhile, rivers in the East fell victim to misinformation and outright backlash to the program. The Delaware became a flashpoint of conflict. Facing an impasse, a few enlightened Park Service planners recognized the need for a different approach, and this would have great significance ultimately to you in Vermont with your 2 designations that happened years later. Those planners developed what would become known as the partnership model for wild and scenic rivers. With this, planning involves local people every step of the way, and I know you went through this process. Instead of crafting a management plan after designation, the partnership approach adopts the plan beforehand. That way, everyone knows what to expect, as they did here along the Westfield River in Massachusetts, and at the Musconetcong River in New Jersey. Little or no land acquisition is done with partnership rivers. The partnership program did not deliver the kind of highly protected corridors typical of the early wild and scenic designations more in the West, but it found a path forward when landowner opposition otherwise made that impossible. In New England and the Northeast, where informed citizens are more typically concerned about the future of their rivers, the partnership program found a special support. Now citizen groups and local governments began to wait in line to engage federal planners for wild and scenic protections. In 2002, 3 rivers in Puerto Rico were added in our only tropical rainforest. But the pace of designation had clearly slowed from those early years. At the same time, the era of big dam building in America had come to a virtual halt. The battle over the Stanislaus River in California was the last dam fight fought at the epic scale in America and lost. New Malones Dam was built, but the combined factors of scientific analysis, conservationist activism, and economic reviews with tightening budgets meant that dam threats were no longer urgent. As this threat declined, so did interest in the wild and scenic river designations that had initially been used principally to stop unwise dam construction in America. But that allowed a whole new set of river conservation issues to rise. In a book I wrote called Lifelines, I called this a second generation of river conservation in America. New interest included pollution from toxic chemicals, runoff from feedlots and farms, clear-cut logging with the erosion that it causes, and floodplain development, which accounts for most of the current loss of natural river frontage in America today. Floodplain development also causes tremendous private and public economic losses. As American Rivers Director, Kevin Coyle responded to the new terrain in river conservation, and in the wake of the 1993 Mississippi floods, he managed to break through the barrier of typical disaster coverage and made the case for floodplain management instead of dams. In this era, protection for native fish also took on greater importance, as did endangered species. The conservation movement was turning more to what lives in rivers. In 2009, President Obama signed legislation for 50 rivers, including Fossil Creek in Arizona, the only wild and scenic river to have recovered from total diversions. It became one of Arizona's finest refuges for reintroduced native fish. In this package, a 5-year campaign by Idaho River United's Bill Sedevy accomplished what had seemed impossible, the designation of multiple rivers through canyons and ranch land of the interior West. After initial hostility, local ranchers supported 16 streams, including the Longsut Bruno. Here's Bill as he and I celebrate his victory with a raft trip through Hell's Canyon. Likewise, a Snake River Headwaters campaign had been launched in Wyoming, where state politics had even halted consideration of the Snake River in its wildlife-rich, incredibly scenic path beneath the Teton Range. To quote Scott Bossy of the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, quote, "Wild and Scenic Rivers in Wyoming had a Republican lock on them, so we needed a Republican key." He cultivated unlikely political partners, and he and others got the support they needed for another 16 waterways, including the Lewis River here as it comes careening out of Yellowstone National Park. Throughout this history, many of the rivers have benefited from wild and scenic designation with improved recreation management, and new recreation facilities have been critical. Conflicts between user groups have been addressed. Meanwhile, the nettlesome issue of land use on private property still persists. The New River is the first stream to be included in American River's Most Endangered Rivers list after it was designated, after, the emphasis here on after, it was designated a wild and scenic river. The state's management plan for it failed to limit trophy home development along the banks. Addressing these kinds of issues, and especially recreation management, two essential groups are the River Management Society, bringing professionals together here on an escape in the Edisto River in South Carolina. Meanwhile, the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council was formed by staff in the 4 federal agencies to advance understanding and policy and stewardship. Challenges remain, but now, after 50 years of this landmark program, I like to think of the glass as half full. When you consider the defensive game that the Craighead brothers played here at the Middle Fork of the Flathead, our gains are impressive. Consider just a few of the rivers that would have been totally lost to dams if it weren't for wild and scenic designation. The Tuolumne in California, Niobrara in Nebraska, the Red River in Kentucky, Rio Chama in New Mexico, Kings in California, the Delaware, and others. Consider our longest designated rivers, which include the Shinjek in Alaska for nearly 300 miles. The Namakogan and the St. Croix is the longest wild and scenic reach in the lower 48. In volume of flow, the largest wild and scenic rivers are the Snake, the Missouri, and the Allegheny in Pennsylvania. Watersheds with the most combined mileage of rivers and tributaries are the Klamath with 537 miles, while the Snake River headwaters include the Gros Ventre here and 414 miles altogether. But while the number of designated rivers has continued to grow, the number of long reaches of them has not. Throughout the history of the program, 27 sections of 100 miles or more were all designated before 1989, less than halfway through the program's current history. The low-hanging fruit, politically speaking, has been picked. A glance at a map shows that most of the designated streams are short and not representative of whole rivers. As we face the next 50 years, it's worth asking, what should the wild and scenic river system become? America has 2.9 million miles of rivers and streams, but only 0.4% of that mileage is in the wild and scenic system. And consider this statistic. Among the top 74 rivers identified by Department of Interior planners back in 1964, only 24 have been designated. The others never gained political backing. Some of the regions of the country are severely underrepresented, such as the South and the Great Plains. And now, as we face the greatest challenge of our times, with the climate crisis, a new package of rivers for protection could include and should include cold waters flowing from ice fields and snowpacks of our highest mountains. Many of the streams of Vermont fall into this category, being especially valuable for cold water and the survival, of course, of our native brook trout, which you have in so many of your Vermont rivers. Here, the West River and the Lamoille, not so far away from you, and the first branch of the White River. Cold tributaries are really important because they nourish troubled main stems. Yukonom Creek here flows from its deeply shaded basin down to the overwarmed waters of the Klamath River in California. Spring-fed streams also guarantee cold water, vital to imperiled habitats below. These are needed by native fish. While the unfinished agenda challenges all of us, new threats increase at rivers that we've already protected. Even though it's been a wild and scenic river since 1981, the North Fork of the Smith is threatened by strip mining under the federal mining law of 1872. Through years of dedication by Barbara Ulian on your right here, this fate has now been averted through an administrative mining withdrawal, but we need permanent legislation to make that last for all time. The good news is that by vision and good planning and a commitment to protecting the best of nature, the wild and scenic system has grown from a few waterways to 300 major streams. This remains the premier means of protecting natural rivers in America. Whether you're on an expedition down an unknown wild river or out for a vigorous day of paddling, or just enjoying a cool float on a summer afternoon, these rivers offer something very special to all of us. They include near urban waterways such as the Allegheny in Pennsylvania. Our wild and scenic rivers deserve our finest care and stewardship so that they'll remain as they are for now and for all the generations to come. We need these rivers for clean water, for everyday escape to the natural world, for their importance to our psyches and our spirits, and as lifelines to entire ecosystems. I urge everyone to take stock of what rivers mean to you, and you have certainly done this with your group in Vermont. Join in the rich legacy of all who came before us with courage and with passion to defend the rivers that we all love and to protect them for the next generation. Each and every one of us can engage in the future of a worthy river, wherever it might be.